Next, we're turning to Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Discourse on Inequality. It's also sometimes referred to as the Second Discourse. This text was written by Rousseau in 1754 for a contest, actually. He didn't win, but it was published in the following year, 1755. So I'll refer throughout the lecture to this year just to historically contextualize some of the claims that he's made. Oftentimes, students will push against this text because of the even more pronounced developments that have been made in the last 200, 300 years with respect to society, culture, technology, government, various dimensions of improvement. And of course, the entire argument of this text is that none of these improvements that we think society has given us are in fact improvements at all. They just make us more and more unequal. It's the central thesis of this book. I'll get more to that in a moment. Tell you a little bit about Rousseau's background. He, as you can see, was born in 1712 and he passed in 1778. So he did live to see the beginning of the American state, 1776, and even before, really. The process began earlier. Rousseau lived in Geneva, but he spoke and wrote in French. He was someone who's known primarily for political philosophy. He's got a few very famous texts on the idea of what a government should be responsible for doing with respect to its people and how the people relate to the government. So he was a big figure in the time of the French Revolution. He was a very important influence to it, in fact. Rousseau is also known for, in addition to his political thinking, his ideas about philosophical education. Rousseau wrote a really well-known book called Emile, which is sort of like a intellectual biography, just like St. Augustine's Confessions. And in this book, Rousseau talks about his intellectual progress and development throughout time. And it's a book that kind of, unfortunately, privileges male enlightenment, actually. It talks about how men should basically leave behind their women and children to seek out enlightenment. So Rousseau is someone who's sometimes known to be a bit sexist of a writer. I'll talk a little bit about that even in this book. We'll see a few examples. And as you see below on the slide here, he's also someone who's unfortunately a bit racist at times. So I'll point those issues out as well. We won't deny any of these traits of Rousseau's text. So we will make sure that we don't just pass over them. We'll acknowledge them as we come to them. One thing that I always tell students when starting with Rousseau, be very careful what you read online about whether Rousseau is a figure who should be claimed by the so-called left or the so-called right. Rousseau is someone who doesn't really neatly fit into our contemporary, particularly American, conceptions of what is the left and what is the right, Democrats and Republicans. Rousseau is someone who, no matter what your political beliefs, no matter what your political ideology looks like, should have something that I think you can use. He's someone who's going to say really a lot of quite controversial things. He's going to say some things in this particular book on the origin of inequality that are going to sound to you quite crazy, in fact. But what I encourage you to do is to try to look at the overall picture and see if there are certain areas with which you can agree with what Rousseau is saying, and then other areas where you have significant disagreement. You don't want to necessarily focus too much on some of the really tentative, speculative claims that he's going to make, and you'll see an example of a few of those in the first part of this book that I'll be talking about in this lecture. So again, whether you're someone who thinks of yourself as left-wing or as right-wing, there's ideas in Rousseau that are going to appeal to you and be ideas that you can use in your own life. So as for this book, we have a few themes. As you see, I've articulated them on the slide here for you. We have a general critique of culture, something a lot of philosophers have done throughout the beginning of Western philosophy, really. Critique of culture is something that Nietzsche, in particular, is really famous for, and something that scares a lot of people away from Nietzsche, in fact. But Rousseau will make a lot of claims that are very similar to things that Nietzsche would later say in the 1800s. But Rousseau came across this sort of topic before Nietzsche did. And Rousseau wasn't the first either. As I said, this is something that has been occupying philosophers for quite a long time. We also have the general theme of knowledge, something we've honestly been working on since the beginning of the year, whether we were reading Plato or Descartes or any of the other people that we've looked at. So Rousseau will approach the idea a little bit differently. He won't approach it in the technical manner that we saw in Plato. He won't really approach it in the general sort of sense that we saw in Kant. And he's also going to be a bit different from Descartes. Rousseau is going to talk really about the differences between states of knowledge throughout time. So how knowledge came to change depending on the historical epoch within which we were discussing it. So what this means is in the beginning, so to speak, think of like your Adam and Eve type situation, knowledge was different. Knowledge wouldn't be defined the same way as it would be in 1755 or in 2017. So obviously you can see here this next word on the slide, progress, that fits quite readily into what we're looking at here, the idea of changes throughout time. Rousseau's also going to have a few very specific points in his critique. He's going to critique the idea of property, something that he shares with Marx, who also wrote later than he did. Rousseau is going to not say exactly the same sort of thing that we see in Marx. In fact, it's more extreme, believe it or not. Marx only wanted property to be public in the sense of factories and the so-called modes of production being owned by the people. Rousseau seems to think that property in general, even individual things that may be in your home, is also a problem with society and the way that we have come to live as the dominant way of life, really. So Marx actually doesn't go anywhere near as far as that. Marx never says that people won't have cars or computers or clothes to wear, this sort of thing. Rousseau seems to almost want to make that move, that property of any sort is something that ultimately started leading us down the wrong road. So he'll get a little more specific with that, and there will be a couple of exceptions and qualifications to make later on. Rousseau's also going to talk about the limitations of government. There's this really clear strain in this book about the way in which government is supposed to make us better off, supposed to have certain goals or objectives that all too often, unfortunately, are not reached. So we'll see Rousseau talk about how some of these things that government can't achieve are actually just fundamental limitations of the very idea of government in the first place. This is something here that might appeal to you, whether you're someone who has left-wing political views or right-wing political views, right? Limitation of government doesn't just mean right-wing libertarianism like what we see in the United States. There are for sure left-wing versions of this as well. In fact, Marxism would be one example on the left. So I'll talk more about that later on. Lastly, we have a couple of themes that are a little more general. Rousseau in this book is going to make really interesting comments and offer some sort of intriguing instances of analysis with respect to animals, the differences between animals and humans in particular. He might say a few things that surprise you. Another big theme in this book, those of you who are into preservation of the environment and ecological sort of efforts towards sustainability and these sorts of things, you'll see a lot of this in Rousseau. Rousseau is very concerned already in 1754 and 5 about the extent to which we are hurting the planet and the extent to which we should maybe reconsider what we're doing. One last thing I want to note here, you'll see it at the bottom here, is that, again, Rousseau's text is something that at times will be racist and sexist, but we want to keep in mind the time in which he wrote the text as well. This isn't to say that it's okay to make some of the comments that he makes, but for example, when Rousseau was alive, only male citizens could vote. So obviously today we know that's a big mistake, and that's something that shouldn't be done, but it is one way in which you can kind of contextualize and understand a little bit why Rousseau may have made comments like these in his text. So before we get started here, and I will split the lecture into two parts, one on the first part of the book and a second on the second part. I want to motivate the problem a little bit. I want to motivate the issue. So I think often we presuppose or take for granted or assume that it's always better to live in the present than it would be to live at any previous point in time. And when we say this sort of thing, we have in mind specifically all of the wondrous inventions and developments that time have given us. To be sure, there's a certain nostalgia for the past, and you have movies like Woody Allen's Midnight in Paris, where Owen Wilson is convinced that he really belonged in a previous point in time where he would have fit in better and been happier and so on. But this sort of idea is one that is equally sort of matched with, I would say, how common it is for us to say exactly the opposite, right? That there's no time like the present, that it's better to live today even than it would have been to be growing up or to be a young student just 20 years ago. Think, for example, of how vital a tool it is that the internet offers you, right? I mean, it's, for most of you, probably hard to imagine being a university student without any easy access to the internet and a computer. It's just almost unthinkable. So to give a few more examples, not just computers, but our math today is better than ever before. It's more sophisticated. It's more nuanced. The same goes for our science. It's never been so polished. We don't have yet the final answers because science, at least in theory, can never really definitively stop and give any sort of final answer on something. There's always more to do. There's always further questions to be asked. But our science is, of course, far more developed than it was just 50 years ago, let alone 250 or 1,000 years ago. Our medicine, also, talk about an applied field of math and science, really, is something that is pretty much better than it's ever been before, right? There are ways to treat diseases today that in the past would have just been completely untreatable and you would have died at a young age. We have all of these cutting edge ways to look into the body without actually cutting it open by way of MRI and X-ray and other forms of visual imaging. We also have, in addition to all of these really important things I said, other conveniences. I already talked a bit about computers, but think about all of the transportation conveniences that we have today. We have personal automobiles, we have trains, we have giant jets that can take you across the Atlantic Ocean. We have things like Uber that are new ways of hailing a cab using a smartphone, right? So a lot of these things make our lives easier. A lot of these things make it just that much more of a fluid process, right, to go through our daily lives. You need to know something, you just look it up real quick on the computer. You need to get somewhere, just really quickly you can make arrangements and get there. It's not like it was 1,000 years ago or even 200 years ago where any sort of trip or any sort of inquiry into a question would involve major effort. So you can already kind of tell maybe one of the reasons why people today say that overall we've gotten lazier and that some of these conveniences are actually just acclimating us to a certain blasé sort of attitude where we can go about our lives with relatively minimal effort. Think back to the Meno paradox, right, and how it says inquiry is either impossible or unnecessary. I'm sorry. And Socrates' response, of course, to the paradox is that it makes you lazy. It says there's nothing to do, right? So sort of like this idea, here we almost have too much to do and it's too easy to do it. Perhaps it's the case that it does make us, in terms of the mind and body, just a little bit lazier today. So I'm already kind of starting to say things similar to what Rousseau is going to be saying in this book, although he's not going to be concerned with laziness, really. Now, lastly, let's think, in addition to the conveniences that I just both sort of spoke the virtues of as well as questioned, you have necessities that are easier to acquire than ever before. Think about clean drinking water, still something that not everyone can easily get access to, even in the United States, even in this country. But for the most part, it's easier to distribute it today than it has been in the past. You also have things like libraries, where you don't have to own books personally. You don't have to own a computer. You don't have to have an internet connection in order to be able to get all of the benefits from these things, right? So we have come a long way in a few respects. And of course, we all know that libraries are always struggling to get funding too, and sometimes shut down, unfortunately, but we'll leave that to the side. So isn't it better, I ask you again, to exist today than it would be to exist at any previous point in time? Rousseau is going to say that maybe we are all, in a way, right, in a certain respect, better off today than we were thousands of years ago. But it depends on what we mean when we say better off, right? Everything I just mentioned sort of talks about good things that our society does for us and enables us to do. But I didn't really talk about how society and culture and government and technology are making us different from how we were in the beginning of time, right? I talked very generally about laziness, but what Rousseau is going to say in this book is that all of these things actually make us more unequal than we've ever been before, that's the real driving change that is enacted by society, that in the beginning we were in a state of profound and radical equality, and as we go throughout time and as we advance in history, this equality is decaying, it's breaking down, and with every passing year it gets worse and worse. Rousseau is going to say that all of the inequality of the world actually could be traced to one tragically bad step in our advancement as a species. One really bad idea that we just couldn't get rid of. We found that once it was in force, once it was rampant and a common enough thing, that we were basically at the point of no return. So we're going to have to wait to see what this specific idea is, but we'll get to it soon enough. I want to talk really generally here before I start with the preface and the first part on the structure of the text. It's essentially broken into 4 parts. We have a dedication, which we will pass over. It's about 15 pages, so hopefully you hear me disregard it here before you actually spend your time reading it. There's nothing really philosophically worthwhile in it for our purposes. After this, you have the first part and the second part, part 1 and 2. At the first pages of part 1, you have a little preface that's only 2.5 pages or so, and it's already built into the first part. So go ahead and read both of those, and of course we'll read part 2 for next week. I want to talk about the 2 questions that are asked in these respective parts. In the first part, we're asking, what is the original nature? What is the original essence? You could really swap in there, if you like, that Platonic term that we used. What is the true form of humanity? Okay, so Rousseau in this first part is going to try to answer that and come up with some properties, some attributes that he thinks define our true, original, natural essence. In the second part, he's going to talk about something else. He's going to say, how is it that society has changed us in our natural essence, in our starting form over time. Okay, and of course you can already tell what the point is going to be in that second part of the book based on things I've already told you. It's going to be that society has changed us for the worse. So part 1 is pages 16 through 44, at least if you're reading the Kress translation of this text that I had the bookstore order. Again, here what we're going to do is describe the essence or nature of the human species, and we're going to look for any differences or inequalities that might have existed at this point in time. And if they existed at this point in time, we'll presuppose that they are therefore authorized by natural law, meaning things that were innate, things that were not in any way the production of humans, right? So not a construct, not something that was just made up, not something that humans in any sense invented. We're talking about something that naturally, innately differentiated us and was, in a sense, because it differentiated us from the beginning, authorized by the laws of the universe itself, right? You could even swap out here, if you like, God himself or herself. Okay, so we're not sure if we're going to find anything, but Rousseau is going to look for any differences or inequalities of this sort. So we want to start out here with the idea of the state of nature. Rousseau says that he's not going to try to return to the absolute beginning of our organism in order to try to define the natural essence of the human, right? So in other words, he's already sort of aware of the idea that we have sort of evolved, right, to use this rather charged term, throughout human history from a much more primordial version of ourselves, where maybe we were walking on all fours, maybe our bodies were completely covered in fur, maybe we even at some point started out in bodies of water and migrated our way onto the land, right? So Rousseau says, I'm not going to try to go that far. I'm not going to try to go to the absolute 0 point of our genesis, right? Instead, I'm going to refer to some state of nature, right, where we resembled ourselves most closely in the form that we know ourselves today, right? So what he means is, I'm trying to go back to the point in time where we looked basically like we do today. We walked around as we do on our back legs, and for the most part, we would be recognizable as human beings. So if you want to think here of Homo sapien sapien, specifically, that's fine. That's probably the sort of idea that Rousseau had in mind without having that exact term. So in the state of nature, Rousseau says, having defined it as we did, the human was the most advantageously organized animal out of all of the animals in the animal kingdom. And the surprising part about this is that this animal was most advantageously organized, but in fact weaker in a physical sense than almost every other animal that was out there, right? So Rousseau's saying this is kind of surprising that this would be the case. But what happens is we had certain virtues and advantages that these other strong animals maybe lacked. So for example, Rousseau says we were able to cope with nature and deal with it in a really clever sort of way. We were able to maybe seek out shelter during a storm or a blizzard when some other animal maybe wouldn't be quite cunning enough to do so and would die out in the elements. So eventually, throughout our steadfast coping with nature and its sort of violent events, right, including even hiding from other predators that maybe wanted to eat us or kill us, we got over time really, really robust. We got really strong in a way, right, in a way that differed from the physical strength of other animals. So Rousseau says on page 19 that we acquired a nearly unalterable temperament. So think of us like rocks, right? We were dependable. We were really capable of lasting or surviving through a difficult situation, even though we maybe weren't as physically dominant as a woolly mammoth or some other large animal. So Rousseau says nature, just like the Sparta that we read about in books about Greece, was something that saw the strong survive. So the humans who made it were ones who were strong. They were ones who were able to last due to their qualities. But Rousseau gives us an interesting comparison here. He says nature is not like the state. Nature is like Sparta, seeing the strong survive and endure, but nature is not like the state. And notice I have state capitalized here, and throughout this book I'll refer to it in the sense in which I refer to it here, meaning a country, meaning a nation, right? Not a state in the sense of Virginia or California, okay? So nature is not like the state because the state makes children a burden to their parents, right? It says that the state almost kills children indiscriminately before their birth. And this seems like a weird thing that he's saying, but what Rousseau means here is that the state kills a child before his or her birth to the extent that it makes the child, right, as a member or a citizen of a state, a nation, a country, what have you, someone who is radically different from his or her true nature. His or her true nature in the beginning of time, in the state of nature, right? When we first started walking around like we do today, acting like humans in a very basic sense, right? We are required by the state to sort of abide by this giant game that all of us are playing, right? Where we live in cooperation and have a job and contribute to the economy and pay taxes and insurance premiums and so on, right? So that's the idea. we want to contrast Rousseau's idea of the state of nature with that of Hobbes, one of his contemporaries, and somebody with whom he disagreed on quite a few issues. So for Hobbes, the state of nature was the war of all against all, right? It was a situation, it was a point in time, right, hypothetical, that was completely violent. You could act on another person for any reason whatsoever. If you liked the stick that someone was carrying, you could just kill him or her to take it, right? It would have just been totally justified. We were all fighting one another for any old reason. Rousseau says that Hobbes thought of the human in the state of nature as someone who was naturally intrepid, meaning someone who was kind of courageous and brave and took risks and acted really boldly, right? Somebody who was willing, as I said, to kill another human for any old reason, just because there was no real thing preventing us from doing so. Now, Hobbes thought that for the greater good of everyone, we all had to lay down this right that we had to kill anyone else, right? And I have greater good there rather redundantly a second time, so you can disregard that. But the idea is we needed government and we needed the state and we needed cooperation and communities in order to get everyone to follow this rule, basically, right? That we're going to say we are not going to continue the war of all against all. We're going to agree to get along and we'll all be the better off for it. So Hobbes thought that we wanted to get away from the state of nature. That's the first really interesting thing I want you to note here. Rousseau does not, right? As you see that I have there on the slide, Rousseau and Hobbes are kind of like opposites when it comes to the state of nature. Rousseau idealizes it, right? Rousseau, as you're going to see him say a lot of things over the next few slides, thought of it kind of as a perfect point in time, whereas Hobbes thought it was hellish. Hobbes thought it was radically violent, that it was something that we had to, at all costs, emerge from, okay? So other philosophers contra Rousseau have said that the human is timid and fearful, right? Someone who is not willing to just act intrepidly and fight somebody for any old reason. Somebody, in other words, who isn't really confrontational. Rousseau is going to say that he doesn't agree with this position, nor does he agree with the position of Hobbes. He says the state of nature wasn't a war of all against all. It wasn't just this absolute warfare, nor was it, at the same time, a state where you had a bunch of naturally fearful humans who were very timid and were just avoiding any sort of interaction or confrontation with anyone else. It's got to be something in between, Rousseau thinks. It's neither of these two extremes. So Rousseau and Hobbes do have one thing in common, and that is that they both understood the state of nature as a hypothetical. They thought it was a thought experiment. You'll see on the internet it referred to as a philosophical fiction. This is the same idea, okay? So they don't think it was a literal point in time. They don't think this state is something that necessarily actually occurred. And some of you are going to have a problem with that. You're not going to understand then why it's such a big part of Rousseau's argument. Locke, by contrast, Locke, who so many American politicians have historically kind of been obsessed with, Locke thought that the state of nature was an actual point in time. He thought it was something that literally occurred and could be discussed and defined in an essential manner. So that's the big difference between the three of these. So Rousseau will, here in the beginning, say one of the things that usually students have the biggest problem with, for how just bold and sort of ludicrous the idea seems to be on the surface, and that is that Rousseau is going to say, look at medicine. Medicine is something that from society and from advancement we think is really great. But he says there's no proof that medicine actually makes us live longer, right? And he says that in the state of nature we were healthier overall, right? Look at, he says, indigenous people and how without the aid of medicine or something like a splint, their wounds heal and their bones are mended on their own. And he says that, again, pretty controversially, right? This seems crazy, just like how he says the lifespan back then was the same as it is now. But Rousseau says they actually healed and had better mended bones, right? Their fractures healed better due to just this natural fix, and that these medical treatments that we have to solve these problems aren't as effective. Rousseau says most of our ills actually kind of stem from our very medicine. So this kind of reminds you of the theory that some people have, often kind of considered to be a sort of conspiracy theory or almost a hoax theory, but some people do believe it, that vaccines cause autism in children, right? So already the way I put that is pretty strong. I said cause, right? Maybe there's some sort of slight correlation between vaccination of children, but a correlation isn't causation, right? Just because there's a correlation between those doesn't mean that they're in fact related at all. There might be many things that are correlated with the onset of autism, right? So that's the problem there. But the idea, right, is kind of similar, for better or for worse, to what we see Rousseau saying here, right? Is a lot of our illnesses and a lot of our diseases are kind of based upon or founded upon the very treatments for them, right? He says we kind of make up new problems, we make up new ills by way of our medicine. He says we should have stuck with where we were in the beginning. We should have stuck with nature's original setup for us, because in nature we didn't need these treatments, these pills, these various medicines and solutions, right? We kind of got on as nature intended, just without the benefit of any of these things. So Rousseau also on this page will say that even the state of reflection, where you sit like a philosopher and think about yourself, right? You think I am a thinking thing, or you think about what truth is, or you think about what you think something like justice or beauty is. Rousseau says even this is something that is contrary to nature itself. We weren't doing this in the beginning. And you'll see why he's going to make that claim, but it's going to relate to how language is a part of our lives. So he continues on about medicine, and he says, however useful medicine that is well administered may be for us, it is certain, he says, that if a sick savage, abandoned to himself, has nothing to hope for except from nature, then conversely he has nothing to fear except from his sickness. And all of this makes his situation one which is preferable to our own. So you see there I have the wording from a different edition, just because it's a little bit clearer. But you'll find that claim on 23 in the Kress translation. So he elaborates. He says, today we're tormented by incisions, talking about surgery. We're poisoned with drugs, and we're wasted by fasting, right? He says that the sick savage, and savage is a term that's today considered often to be a bit racist and something we don't really use at university, right? But Rousseau uses the term throughout this text, right? This savage didn't have to deal with any of these things, so he had nothing to hope for, right, except for whatever nature gave him, and at the same time he didn't have to worry about the side effects or the negative consequences of his treatment, right? He completely did not have to concern himself with that. No commercials with the small print at the end and the person who quickly speaks about all of the bad things that might happen to you if you start taking some prescription. So Rousseau moves from here to the claim that there are various obvious differences between us as we exist today and ourselves as we would have existed in this hypothetical state of nature, right? So-called savages. And one of the obvious differences is that we were clearly stronger. We didn't have to treat ourselves with these things. So maybe if we read him charitably and try to make as much sense of his argument, we could say perhaps at that point in time the lifespan wasn't as long, even though Rousseau says it is, right? We kind of know that's pretty much almost certainly something that's false, right? Maybe we didn't live quite as long, but maybe it is true that because we only relied on nature and ourselves in a way, that we could be argued to have been stronger back then. So how did we get away from this? Well, Rousseau says we were separated from nature by society and culture. He says in becoming sociable and in becoming a slave, we grew feeble, timid, and servile. He says that a soft and effeminate way of life completed the enervation both of our strength and of our courage. Right, so this is pretty explicitly sexist, to follow up from the pretty racist stuff we saw a moment ago. And of course, you'll see also Rousseau saying other things that today aren't often said, right? It shouldn't be said. But what is the point here, right? Well, he's saying that society kind of didn't give us a choice. That once it became common and became the norm, that it enslaved us from the position of radical freedom that we had in nature, right? In this hypothetical state of nature. Society and culture violently pulled us from this. And in doing so, they made us reliant upon other people, upon other things, right? That made us soft and effeminate, like a woman, he says, right? So again, not the most rigorous way to put this point. It's just pretty much a sexist figure of speech that he has. But we see what he's getting at here when he says this. We wouldn't have to make the point in the sexist terms that he makes. So Rousseau says, I'm going to shift from metaphysical aspects or features of us to metaphysical difference or metaphysical features. And he says the big difference in the state of nature between the human and the beast was free will, right? So the idea is that we can deviate from rules of nature, whereas an animal can't, right? An animal is only instinctual. An animal does what it's programmed to do. Rousseau says we were always capable of violating that. We were always capable of deviation from things, right? We had this dimension of choice, this dimension of liberty that animals never really had, okay? So you want to think about whether that's necessarily something you agree with, but Rousseau says this is why we can do things like lose ourselves to eating and drinking too much, right? He says an animal can't do this. You would never see an animal in the wild that was just morbidly overweight, right? You may see a big animal, you may see one that's very healthy looking, but you won't see one who is just completely lost himself to eating too much food. It just doesn't happen as far as Rousseau is concerned. Rousseau gives the example, too, of the pigeon sitting next to a bowl of meat, and the pigeon is starving, and the pigeon doesn't realize, and of course, if any of you have ever seen a New York pigeon, this is also a suspect example, because they seem like they're willing to eat anything, but as far as Rousseau is concerned, that pigeon won't eat from the bowl of meat. It will starve before it tries what's in that bowl, because it's just not in the pigeon's natural programming to eat that, right? And the pigeon isn't able to sort of step outside of those limits, whereas we always could. So Rousseau adds, intellect depraves the senses, it worsens them, right? It deteriorates them, and the will continues to speak even when nature is silent, right? So this should sort of sound to you like Descartes a bit when he was describing a bad judgment where the will extends further than the intellect, right? But for Rousseau, it's a bit different. He's making a slightly different point here when he says that intellect actually kind of depraved our senses, whereas we should have been relying on our senses. And eventually what happened is we willed towards the intellect too much, right? And we forgot that we weren't really possessing any sort of natural knowledge or evidence of something. We kind of got lost in our heads, so to speak. So the problem here, of course, is Rousseau's kind of questioning the intellect, whereas Descartes was saying that if we're proper philosophers, we'll always make sure that the intellect is our standard, and we won't extend the will further than the intellect. Rousseau probably wanted to dispense with the intellect itself. And speaking of the intellect, for Rousseau, perhaps a bit surprisingly, it actually isn't intellect that distinguishes us from animals. A lot of people, I think, take for granted that this is the big thing that separates us from animals. But for Rousseau, animals actually have intellects. He says animals can associate ideas. And we know that they do this because they have senses. So just like we saw in Descartes, Rousseau has a kind of broad idea of an idea, right? He has a broad conception of an idea because objects of vision, things that you hear, things that you taste. For Rousseau, these are ideas, right? Not just when you close your eyes and contemplate about, the idea of your success in the future or something like this. A purely mental, purely conceptual idea, right? This isn't what Rousseau, or Descartes for that matter, had in mind when they used this term. So he says animals do have these ideas, right? So it's not actually intellect that makes us different from animals. As I said, it's that nature commands every animal, and the animal has to obey. Right? I already gave you the example of the bird that's starving by the bowl of meat. Rousseau says the human is also driven. The human is also commanded by nature. But unlike animals, we're able to push back, right? We're able to say no to nature and do things our way. And maybe that's sometimes something that's for the worse, right? But for Rousseau, that's all free will is. Rousseau says we also, in addition to free will, can have consciousness of our freedom, right? The animal, Rousseau thinks, can never have this. And lastly, we might note that science can't completely explain how it is that the will even has force, right? How it brings things about. So this is why we're talking about the free will and how it was one of our defining essences, or one of our defining traits in this hypothetical state of nature, right? In addition to the physical things that we've already discussed regarding our strength paired with our tenacity. Another metaphysical difference between the animal and the human is that we're able to improve ourselves. We're able to progress in a way that animals aren't able to do. Rousseau says at the end of your life, you may have mastered all sorts of things, you may have acquired all different sorts of knowledge, but in old age, you're capable of losing all of this. You forget. You maybe aren't physically able to do motions from a sport that you were really great at in your teens or in your 20s or even your 30s, right? So Rousseau says when this happens, what occurs is we fall even lower than the animal, right? We elevated ourselves to a certain position, but when we lose track of this position, we're back to the bottom of the so-called totem pole. And what's interesting is, to the extent that many animals are physically stronger than us, and we have this intellectual, metaphysical advantage of improving ourselves, it presumably follows from the faculty of the will, right? That's the cause of this. So Rousseau will carry on with this metaphysical discussion and say that our reason, perhaps in contrast to animals, is something that was enhanced by our passions. And this is what drove us to want to know things in the first place, to have knowledge. You see a very similar point that's made in philosophers like Aristotle and even Aquinas, St. Thomas Aquinas, right? It's our curiosity, it's our intrigue in the face of a mystery that makes us want to know something at all, right? He says, why do we want to know things? Well, it's because we desire to enjoy. And this is why he says that it's enhanced by passions, right? In short, we could say that knowing things makes us happy. Knowing things is something that gives us pleasure, right? So our passions are all based in what we need, right? We need to be happy, Rousseau thinks. We need to enjoy things. It's not something that's just superfluous and, the last thing that you should be concerned about. For Rousseau, it's actually one of the most important things of all, right? So if it's true, though, that our passions are based in what we need, right, and are themselves developed by our knowledge, you can kind of see then how even from the beginning we were sort of set up to change throughout time, right? Now, the distinction to make would be things that we needed and things that we didn't need, right? We may have eventually changed in ways that were unnecessary, and these are the ways that Rousseau is condemning. But as you'll see in our next and final text for this course, Rousseau basically has in mind a relationship between passion and knowledge that operated in both ways, right? So at the same time that passions were developed by what it meant to know, what it meant to have knowledge, at the same time what it meant to have knowledge was sort of developed by and enhanced by our ever progressing passions and desires, okay? So Rousseau says there's a big difference between pure sensation and even the simplest type of knowledge that we could have. And here he really is echoing Nietzsche. He says, imagine how many times a fire went out in the hypothetical state of nature and the people didn't have any idea how to restart it, right? So with the dichotomy here between pure sensation and the simplest type of knowledge on the other hand, what we have in mind here is, again, the sense in which, to refer back to that other slide I showed you a moment ago, how we kind of, with our wills, were able to turn away from what types of knowledge we received just from the senses, right? We sort of depraved, so to speak, our sense-based sources of knowledge, in part using the will, right? But what we sort of mapped over these senses with was the intellect. And Rousseau says that's a big gulf there between the world that we lived in and the state of nature where, we saw what we saw and tasted what we tasted, and then the very first sorts of knowledge and some world that came about later where all of a sudden we had concepts, we had words to describe flavors and things that we saw and even colors, right? Imagine, I mean, this is, a stereotypical line from a philosophy professor, but imagine before we had names for colors, before we had any idea of Roy G. Biv, right? And, these very distinct, separate classifications for color. I mean, we lived in this radically differentiated world where everything sort of was unique, right? You maybe would look at a red cup and then a cup that was red-orange. Of course, I'm using a bad example here because there were no cups, period, in the state of nature. But maybe you didn't even associate the two, right? You wouldn't have been capable of, identifying one as red and the other as red-orange. You just saw what you saw, and you had this really primitive engagement with it. It's kind of something that'll freak you out a little bit if you think about it. But Rousseau here is making this comment to differentiate himself from other philosophers who have said that in the state of nature, we were smart. We were like little philosophers. We had, all of these pretty sophisticated concepts and ideas that we started with. Rousseau says that wasn't the case at all. That all happened much later in time. And it's not really clear in the first place that we're very smart at all, right? Since we didn't have these so-called smarts, these fancy intellects full of concepts and ideas in the state of nature. So I'll start the next lecture on Rousseau's discussion of language in the first part.